Hi, welcome to Shift Storm, a podcast about change. I'm your host, Chris Cowan, and with me today is my friend, Miguel Gallegos. Your story is interesting because it's not like there's just one moment where everything changed.
You know, you get to prison and there's this community. The gang leaders are the ones who, set the laws. We were at war. That led to gun violence, and that night he caught a murder. Wow. He got life. He's still incarcerated today. If I would have gone back, I would have been with him. The preacher looked at me and he's like, "So when are we going to baptize you?" When I came out of the water, I felt clean. Felt like a weight had been lifted up.
You describe it as cultish. Would you change anything about your conversion?
Can people really change? What are the moments that shape us? What causes some people to drastically switch their beliefs while others seem to stay the same? Is it something that happens to us? Is it something we can control? Let's explore these questions together through personal stories of those who have encountered the Shift Storm.
Looking back, would you change anything about your conversion?
I wouldn't. I think my conversion was definitely authentic and real.
Mm-hmm.
I think that now I kind of wish that I would have left earlier, but things always happen for a reason. And sometimes one of the things too is that you have to understand that I came from a family where we kept secrets. Right? There was violence. There was like control. Oh my God, control. And then you join a gang. And when you join a gang, everything that you do reflects on the gang. The gang reflects on you, right? And so you have to live by rigid rules and control, right? The gang says show up to a meeting, you show up to a meeting. And if you don't, there could be consequences. And a lot of times, be happy if they just get two people to jump you as your discipline, right?
Wow.
Then you go to prison, and it's a whole nother level. In prison, our group didn't permit foul language. It was like, you don't talk like that because you represent us, and we represent you, and we care about our image, right? And so, some young guy coming and cussing his whole life and being told you can't cuss, after a couple warnings, you might get your face cut up and then you're now labeled as no good. And, you didn't do nothing serious, but you just couldn't stop cussing. But now your prison career is ruined. Now you got to live with the child molesters and snitches, right? And so those are the things that when you think about that, not only the rigidity, the harshness, right? But the control, the mind control. And when you are in leadership positions like that, and you're in control of other people's lives, especially as a young guy, right? I was 18 and I was running yards. When older, people 38, 40 years old come and tell you, dude, tell me what to do to prove myself to you. That's going to get to your head, right? And so then you enter into the church world where, of course, narcissism doesn't exist, right?
No, of course not. No.
and so you enter into the church world, and now you got, control, and then you got adoration because you see the people, how they, honor and respect the pastors, and the people in leadership, how they're looked at. And it's like, ooh, here's another thing to strive for, right? And then when you get someone to come to you and be like, God has called you, you got an anointing over your life, then, you start, believing that. And that can be a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
For me, it was.
That is the danger, I think, sometimes of when we have religion, it can be such a good thing in people's lives.
Right.
And it is a double-edged sword because in any community, there's a natural power structure that tends to form, I feel like. And when you put God into the mix of that, and you have people speaking on behalf of God, that gives them a whole different authority that transcends any other kind of group, because you're talking about the creator of the universe at that point. And unfortunately, like, the potential for abusing that ability can be really dangerous.
And when you take into consideration, especially in Spanish-speaking churches, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who are the majority of the population there?
Yeah.
Immigrants. Right? And when you look at, let's say, just Latin America and the history, you know, the governments, the wars, you know, communism and all that, these people are susceptible to religious abuse, you know. And I've heard people say, you know, Pastor, should I pay my bills this month? You know, and that's not stretching it. They're literally, you know, and one of the things, let me give you an example. The pastor was preaching, and the pastor started yelling at certain people. You know, their homes went into foreclosure, and he's like, "You never even bothered to ask me if you should buy a house or not." He's like, and then you wonder why you foreclosed. God ain't gonna bless that.
Wow.
Right? And there's people that are hearing this, and I know someone right now that almost every major decision, they go and they ask their pastor first. And that's one of the reasons that I'll tell you, I don't take any patients or clients from churches of pastors that I know, because I often teach people autonomy and you know, personal responsibility and things that go against what I find a lot of pastors are preaching these days, right? And so that's another major change that, you know, there's it just, I really think that there's a lot that's being preached that goes against you know, personal agency.
What was your oh crap, I'm in a cult moment?
Here's the thing. I feel like I still attend a cult. Except, here's the thing. I tell my wife, I'm like, no one's going to tell me how to run my home.
Yeah.
And I really do believe in working out your own salvation, fear and trembling.
Yeah.
Right? And at the end of the day, I'm going to stand and give account my household. I'm the pastor of my household, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to allow someone to tell me how to parent or how to operate within my marriage when that is outside of their scope of practice, right? And so I think, you know, some people stay in your lane and I'll stay in mine.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is it's less about, like, because a cult can mean like, oh, they just have weird beliefs and I don't agree with them.
Right.
But a cult can also mean a cult of control.
Right.
And like, I'm crossing
there's
lines.
degrees, right? And the reality is, right, if you look at the New Testament, and not to be one of those, the original Greek, but in the book of Acts, it talks about the Pharisees considered Paul and, you know, and Christians a new cult, right?
Yeah.
And so there's going to be degrees of it. And for example, you know, you got your Jeff Warrens and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're in a place where people are saying, drink this Kool-Aid, or, you know, give me your daughters and all this other stuff, then that's a group that I tell people, you need to get away, right?
Yeah. The
moment they start saying stuff like that, to some degree, the moment they start saying, hey, you want to buy a house, come and ask me my permission, then that's a good, hey, this dude is out of line, you know, that's just not even, you know, it's not okay.
Yeah.
That's a major personal decision. Now, I could understand one going and seeking advice, seeking people who seem that are financially stable and stuff like that for advice and things like that. But, you know, as a therapist, when people tell me what to do, I had someone tell me, I need you to tell me how to function normal in society. And my response is always, I don't tell you what you should do. I tell you what you could do. If you want to be told what you should do, go see a counselor. Counselors will tell you what to do. I'll teach you. I won't tell you what to think. I'll teach you how to think, so that you could think for yourself.
Yes,
and that I find has been one of the biggest, I guess, conflicts with a lot of churches, local churches, things like that.
That is so troubling that there is this belief, this culture of turning off your brain,
anti-intellectual,
and they'll take verses. Faith is the evidence of things unseen, and that kind of thing, and like out of context, that sounds like, oh, so I should just turn off my brain, and ignore all the proverbs about seeking wisdom, seeking understanding, and not being like, okay, this person's my surrogate for God, and I'll just have to listen to everything they say and turn off my brain. You called out the verse, work out your own salvation in fear and trembling. Like, what does that look like to you?
To me, it really means that my salvation is in my hands, and I need to figure it out. And I need to take seriously things of ultimate importance.
So you left this church that was cultish, but then you kind of say, well, I'm kind of still in this other cult. What do you mean by that?
I attend a Pentecostal church.
Okay.
And one of the things, one of the things that identifies a lot of cults is when there is uniform in the way of dress, right? Manner of dress. And so there's these very rigid rules about dress. But again, there's degrees to it, because there's some churches that, like you see the Mormon fundamentalists, right? Not that I'm comparing to them, but it's a good example on the spectrum of it, that, you see these in documentaries and on the news, right, where they're all wearing these certain type of dresses and only certain types of colors. And I've been to a lot of churches that way. Some more focus on other things than others, but literally, the church that I attend, the women are only to wear skirts or dresses. And they the rule in our church is that the skirts and dresses have to be below the knee or covering the knee when standing. And like sleeves have to be at the elbows, and then sleeves also at the elbows, because it's the natural bend of the arm, which there's
can't have you seeing them elbows,
right. And so things like that, and I have found that everybody struggles with when you have so many rigid rules, right? No one is going to be able to live up to the standard. Everyone's going to fail. Right? And so it makes you question, well, what's the purpose? And a lot of times it's separation. The church should be separated from the world. And I get that. I get biblical principles. But oftentimes when you have people who are presenting biblical principles or ideas, right? But they're making them out to be as Holy Writ, whereas coming from the oracle of the Lord, then you need to sit down, because you're out of pocket, right? When people are presenting rules as more important than even salvation. We invited a friend, and this person showed up, and she loved it. She loved the church. She loved everything about it. But she was wearing lipstick. And then lo and behold, one morning there's a preaching about lipstick. and basically you're a whore. And then someone turns around and tells my friend, they're like, "Don't worry, you'll get used to it." And my friend never wanted to go back, and that's sad, And I do think that, generally speaking, I mean, people are going to misspeak, especially from pulpits, speaking in public speaking, you're going to misspeak. But I also think that, you do wrong when you double down. And if you misspeak, correct it.
Right.
And a lot of times what you see is a lot of doubling down, people not correcting stuff that they say and things like that. And that can make things difficult. But for example, as I said, I run my home, and I set the standard in my home. And that's how it is. So, we do have a place where we attend, and, when we're there, that's where we've been, where we have our family. But, at the end of the day, I'm the pastor of my home, and I think that I'm doing a pretty good job. My relationship with my kids is incredible. And, I've done a lot of work with a lot of pastors' kids, famous bishops and things like that. And I've worked with a lot of their kids, grandchildren, and, the lifestyles aren't matching up. Something's wrong.
Right.
You could be in the holy of holies on a church platform, but you could see when things are off. Same thing with you have no idea how many people in ministry, both men and women, who will fast, right, for days on end, and then get off a fast and binge, and then somebody happens to mention it from the platform. Oh,
right.
So and so's been fasting for 16 days for you, and this and that, and it's like, oh, that person has an eating disorder.
Right.
So there's a lot of things like that you see here. The narcissism, oh my God,
Yes.
pretty out of control these days, especially with social media, and preachers are now public figures and all this other stuff. And who has the most likes, and it feels like we're slipping further and further away from authentic Christianity.
Yeah. That is a tale as old as Christianity. Is like, we have this natural inclination toward making it about what we can accomplish.
Right.
We have this natural inclination toward, okay, like, yeah, God, okay, it's great that you want to give me this free gift, that you want to give me all this grace and all that, but like, what about me? It's like, I want to feel like I'm the one earning this, and being able to, like, okay, if I follow enough rules, if I make up enough rules, if I get enough people to follow my rules, no relationship is going to survive if its rules outweigh the connection.
Right.
And I think that's such a habit we fall into when it comes to religion, when it comes to, any group where there's a possibility of power, which is every group. There's going to be this natural inclination toward rigidity. Like, I've talked to people who are, not Christian, not even, wouldn't call themselves religious, and would just, present themselves as these free spirits. Some of the most judgmental people are the people who are, calling out others for being judgmental.
Right.
Some of the most rigid people are the people who are like, I don't even believe in morals.
Right.
And they'll be super rigid about, quick to call people the next Hitler.
Right.
So it's just human nature, and it does start with, we can't turn our brain off. We can't delegate our critical thinking skills to anyone else. I do want to talk just briefly about this book. Oh, here we go. I got a little bit of shine here. How long ago did you write this book? It's called Con, A Story of Redemption.
I think
I read it, and
I started it in 2008. I think I finished it like in 2010, 11, something like that. It went through a couple revisions and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I read it, and I have a hard time like finishing books. I'm an audiobook junkie now, and that's what keeps me actually consuming books. But I'm so bad at like reading physical books. I read this one. It's been a while.
I just bought a new book yesterday, and my wife was like, "You don't even read the ones at home," and I'm like, "I read them through chapters."
Yes.
I open them up and I look up chapters in them.
Yeah, that works. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah. So this came out a few years ago now. It's a great story. Is this still available for sale somewhere?
It's out of print. I believe.
It is.
Yeah.
Find your copy on eBay for $200 then, is what I'm hearing.
I'm actually been considering rewriting it and doing it with the different publisher. There was issues with the publisher.
This was a few years ago. What's your trajectory been since then? Have you changed much since you wrote this?
Definitely have changed a lot. I think in every domain of life.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
For example, I used to be more rigid as far as things having to do with salvation, despite having read, salvation is mine, saith the Lord, and I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. Read that so many times, and then one day I was like, wait a minute, this really is his business, and why am I trying to, shove things down other people's throats, and who am I, right? And so I do believe that we all have a responsibility to rightly divide the word. But I think oftentimes we tend to overcomplicate things. And it just, if we just keep it simple, I feel that's my opinion. If we just kept it simple, and I've always felt called to be a pastor. Who knows? I mean, I'm in a wheelchair, paralyzed. Who knows if I'll ever end up doing that? But if I ever do, I think the focus will definitely be simple, and it'll be at the end of the day to reveal God to a lost and dying world.
You mentioned, I think you touched on it earlier. I know in the book you describe yourself as like politically conservative. Would you still describe yourself as that, or do you feel like that's changed at all?
I think in many ways, yes and no. Because I actually believe that conservatism makes a lot of sense. It really does. And I do think that overall, it is a better way of thinking. I think it's simpler. I think politicians complicate those things. And another thing that I tell people is, yes, conservatism does make sense, but people don't always make sense. And so we can't apply sweeping generalizations on entire groups of people. And I think that's where... for example, my beliefs on the border has changed. There was a time when I was a staunch, secure it, deport everybody, blah, blah, blah. I now do immigration assessments for people who are going through the immigration process. And I'm helping people, helping victims of crime, victims of sex trafficking, and here's the thing. Here's where I changed even more. Is I personally know a lot of therapists who consider themselves Christian, and if it's just someone who comes from a different lifestyle, and they're like, "I'm sorry, this isn't my specialty," and I think that's sad, right? And so I have helped a lot of people. And to me, I don't discriminate age. I don't discriminate gender. I don't discriminate color, it's not going to matter to me, or orientation.
Yeah.
And I've helped a lot of people. And I think that the work that I'm doing now is far more important and valuable than anything that I did in the past.
Wow.
I was a preacher for 15 years, and going around preaching, I was preaching to the crowd, to the choir,
Yeah.
preaching to saints. And
Yeah.
And I think that the work that I do now, I really am in the trenches, and it's meaningful work.
I can't imagine how much your life experience, the changes you've gone through, your childhood, being able to speak to that and what you went through and what your beliefs and mentality were at the time, and what a drastic shift that has been.
Yeah.
From prison, to marriage and family therapist,
Right.
is pretty incredible. And I can only imagine how well that equips you when you're relating to people who a lot of people can't relate to.
Yeah, it definitely helps. I was just in the emergency department on Tuesday, and you're working with people on gurneys and coming from all kinds of walks of life, and you're sitting there trying to figure out, is this person a danger to themselves, a danger to others, or gravely disabled, and you can make a decision that could really affect the rest of their lives. And I don't take that lightly.
Yeah.
And so it's I have definitely been able to lean on my life experiences and my education. I really do feel that has helped me to move further in life, to change.
You mentioned you're in a wheelchair. Tell us a little bit about that story.
So in 2002, I was diagnosed with cancer, and immediately when I started chemotherapy, I started losing strength just rapidly. And I went from walking with a cane to walking with crutches, to when I would go to the mall, I'd be in a wheelchair. And it was around age, I was 30 years old when I was misdiagnosed with polymyositis.
Okay.
And then a few years later, long story short, went to UCSF, and then they connected me with the Jane Foundation, and they diagnosed me with muscular dystrophy. They kept on asking me, "Are your parents from the same tribe?" And I'm like, "No, my mom was born in Mexico, totally different country." And they actually meant Jewish tribe. Apparently, my parents shared a Jewish gene, and
wow.
it originates in Israel, and it's the dysferlin gene that doesn't work. So my body is not able to produce or to contain protein.
What popped into your mind when you heard that diagnosis?
Honestly, to me, I was more surprised about the genetic stuff they were telling me, because at that point I was already in the wheelchair, and I already, it's like I felt there is no reversing this, and there was a little bit of anger for not, there was a misdiagnosis, and I think some stuff with the doctor, that the doctor ended up leaving the country. I don't know if it was because of my case or something else. Someone else he might have misdiagnosed, but he was gone, took records. Before the muscular dystrophy diagnosis, the doctor that misdiagnosed me had told me that, I was going to die suddenly, and I could die at any moment. It was really doom and gloom. And it was 2 weeks before we found out my wife was pregnant. So that was more devastating. So by the time I got the muscular dystrophy diagnosis, I was like, this isn't that bad. There was always a fear because, the research, which was older research, people were only living to about 39. But you have to consider too, back then, people were, they would fall, hit their head, die, choke on food. I try to take care of myself. It's going to kill me at some point, but, I think the initial, where they were like, oh, this is going to be suddenly. Well, yeah, I can still be suddenly, but I think that I'm eating healthy and I get out there trying my best to live and appreciate each day.
Is that in your mind often as you're living your life?
That's always, on my mind and the future. But it's also in terms of, just the other day, my wife and I were talking about, growing up and dying together, being buried together. So, it has its downsides, but it also has, something to look forward to.
To me, I feel like there's so many different rabbit trails I could go down, because you're someone who just has experienced so many different changes, and I feel like there's so many different rabbit trails I could go down. I guess my final question is, because this is kind of how we started this, is you talked about at the beginning empathy, and you talked about how you could and did stab someone, and now you feel like you
and shot
you
people
have
before.
empathy. Yeah, and now you have empathy, which is probably pretty important for your line of business.
Yeah.
Just can you briefly talk about just where that comes from?
Sometimes I really have to work at it, because my wife tells me you really could be cold-hearted and a jerk at times. So I really do have to work at it. But when you have someone sitting across from you and, they're telling you their life story, and you are able to say, I know exactly what you mean. I get it. And, when they feel heard, when they feel seen, there's something, it's almost like it's reciprocal. It comes back, and at the end of an appointment, when someone looks at you and they're like, thank you, after all these years, finally makes sense, and you help me, then that drives me. That drives me.
Yeah.
And it's how I get back from what I do.
Does it ever go the other direction where you're like, I've been through real shit, and you sitting here in my office are complaining about nothing? Is there ever that? Okay.
Never. No. And here's the reason why. I really believe that especially our early childhood experiences, our formative years, they really do shape us, and it impacts our brain. So oftentimes when I see people that they're going through something, but it's not what I went through. Well, they're going through it and they're experiencing it based on their childhood experiences, right?
Yeah.
My daughter one time told me, and it was really eye-opening. She's like, sometimes you guys share your story, you and Mom, about, how hard it was. Because my wife also came from a very dysfunctional home. And my daughter says, and, that was your worst, but this is my worst. And I was like, I get it. Wow. I totally get it. And, so it leads me to see that, trauma, right? The word trauma, and we in mental health, we separated it into two different categories: big traumas, war, rape, assaults, things like that, and little traumas, right? That constant wounding of the self-esteem, right? And that's where you start talking more along the lines of complex, like PTSD and things like that. Yeah. But trauma is not the event. Trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is what happened inside of you. It's how it impacted you, right?
Yeah.
And so one event can impact me in one way, but it can impact someone in a whole nother way. And that's their experience, and I can't put myself in their shoes, because if I put myself in their shoes, I'm bringing all of my life experiences, my education, all of my resources and skills into their individual, unique experience that really is unfair to them. And so everybody's going through something, and it could be to different degrees, but it's still impacting them in different ways. And I get an opportunity to at least try to help people.
Again, I feel like I could go on so many rabbit trails because I just love hearing like all of this and so much of what you've experienced and the wisdom you've gained through all of this is endlessly fascinating to me personally. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show, to share your story. Do you want people to find you on social media?
They want to follow me. The stories is where they'll find stuff that they might find useful. My handle is at Mig_Gal. And the message that I give everyone is be kind to yourself.
Amen to that. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining, Miguel. Thank you so much for listening. And if you could leave us a review wherever you found us, I would personally appreciate that. Miguel says he would appreciate that. I'm putting words in his mouth. But it would mean a lot to us. Tell people about our show and keep changing.